Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions in the woods of North America. I'm talking about people who are right in front of someone and then in an instant, they're just gone. Or in other cases, they disappear and then are found again, but they're located in places that are impossible to get to. One former police detective named David Paulides has investigated thousands of these strange disappearances, and he documents what he finds in his incredible book series called Missing 411. Today, we're going to look at 3 Missing 411 cases that even amongst strange disappearances, these rank as particularly bizarre. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the like button a free stay at a Motel 6, but call ahead of time to ensure the staff does not leave the light on for them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Seward, Alaska is a port city that's about 60 miles south of Anchorage, and it's home to one of the oldest foot races in America called the Mount Marathon Race. Now, this race is not actually a marathon because a marathon by definition is 26.2 miles long. The Mount Marathon Race is actually only 3 miles long, but it's considered one of the most challenging short races in the world because it's basically 1.5 miles straight up a mountain and then 1.5 miles straight back down again. Despite its grueling nature, there had never been a fatality or a disappearance during the running of this race, but that changed in 2012. 66-year-old Alaskan resident Paulides was a career counselor on a military base in Anchorage. His job was to help outgoing military members adjust to civilian life, and his primary responsibility was helping them with their resume. Outside of work, Paul liked to keep himself in top physical shape, and one of his favorite activities was going for runs. And so in 2012, he finally committed to running the Mount Marathon Race, something he had wanted to do for some time, but he kept putting it off. In the months leading up to the race, Paul trained hard to make sure he was ready. He wasn't trying to win the race or really even be competitive. He just wanted to finish the race in a respectable time. So at 3 p.m. on July 4th, 2012, Paul found himself at the start of the Mount Marathon Race, and his family was on the sidewalk cheering him on. The race director fired the starting gun, and Paul, along with 500 other racers, took off. For reference, a man of Paul's age and physical fitness level should be able to complete this race in about 2 hours or less. But at 5 p.m., when virtually all the other runners had finished the race and Paul was nowhere to be found, his family members were concerned, but they knew he wasn't trying to win the race. They knew he was probably going to be on the slower end, but they were now starting to pay attention and were anxious for him to show up. 45 minutes later, a race timing crew up at the top of the mountain at the turnaround point began breaking down their setup. About 15 minutes later, when they were done, they started walking down the mountain right as Paul showed up at the top. And they said to him, "You are the last racer on this course. Do you still want to continue?" And he said, "Yes, I definitely still want to continue." And so the timing crew said, "That's fine. Just take your time, be careful, and we'll see you at the bottom." And so the timing crew, they take off right in front of Paul, going straight down this well-marked course, and they would turn around and see Paul standing there, catching his breath, getting ready to make his own descent. And so the timing crew, who was moving much faster than Paul, very quickly got out of sight of him. And so before long, they were at the bottom, they turned around, and there's no sign of Paul. So they went and found Paul's family and said, "Hey, we just spoke to him. He seems totally fine, but just so you know, if you don't see him in 90 minutes, I would contact the race officials and let them know, because he should be down by then." And so Paul's family sat at the bottom of this race looking up, expecting to see him any moment, but 90 minutes came and went and he never showed up. They wound up waiting another 30 minutes just in case, but again, he didn't show up, and so they informed race officials. The race officials immediately contacted the Alaskan State Troopers, and a search was launched for him because now fog's rolling in, this is a dangerous course, and it's starting to get pretty late. All night, hundreds of expert Alaskan searchers combed this mountain, both on the course, outside the course. They even went on the backside of Mount Marathon, where it would have been extremely difficult for Paul to have gotten there. He would have had to climb up and over the mountain, which is just extremely unlikely, but they figured we can't leave any stone unturned. And so all night they're looking, they got dogs out, and there's no sign of him. The next morning, when the fog cleared up, they brought in helicopters with thermal cameras, and they continued to search the mountain. But after 4 more days, they never found Paul or any of his his belongings, and so they called off the search. It was like Paul had just vanished. Now, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that Paul must have just gotten disoriented and lost the course track, and then maybe he fell, or he was attacked by an animal like a bear, because this is Alaska, but there's a couple problems with that. The first one is the course itself is extremely well marked. This race is one of the oldest in America. They've been doing this for over 100 years, and they've never had a missing person or a fatality, so they know how to keep people safely inside of the course bounds. The other issue is the timing crew saw Paul at the top, at the turnaround, and he was physically okay. He was talking to them, he was not distressed, and he would have very clearly seen where to go next, because he would have seen the timing crew leaving ahead of him, going down the trail that he would have to follow. Clearly, something unusual happened to Paul either at the summit after the timing crew left or on the way down, because rational explanations cannot account for how Paul could vanish so completely in such a controlled environment with so many expert searchers looking for him. But to this day, no one has ever found Paul or even the slightest trace that he was ever on that mountain. In late August of 2004, Kevin Bardsley and his 12-year-old son Garrett went on a father-son Boy Scout camping trip in the Uinta Mountains in northern Utah. Their campsite was situated next to Lake Quiberon inside of the Wasatch National Forest. The lake was actually pretty remote and difficult to access because it was almost completely surrounded by huge mountains. The only side you could get to the lake on was its western side, but the western trail leading to it was very cumbersome because you had to bypass 7 different lakes. And so by the time Kevin, Garrett, and the rest of the Boy Scouts and their fathers were at the lake, they were at least an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization. Early in the morning on August 20th, Kevin and Garrett woke up, they hopped out of their tents. None of the other campers had woken up yet, and so they decided they would head down to the lake to get some early fishing in. And so they got their gear and they began walking down the very well-defined 150-meter long trail down to the lake. As they get there, the sun's coming up over the mountains, and they're really excited about their day of fishing. And so as Kevin is preparing a fishing rod for Garrett, Garrett was jumping around on different stones that were poking out of the water. And at some point he tripped and he fell into the water, soaking his shoes and his pants. And so he hopped out of the water and he's kind of laughing at himself, and he told his dad that he didn't care. He'd fish with wet feet and wet pants and he would change them later. And so Kevin laughed and handed his son his fishing rod, and then the two of them began to fish. After a while, when they hadn't caught anything, Garrett said to his dad that, "You know what, Dad, this is actually pretty uncomfortable. I'm gonna go change my pants and my socks." And so Kevin said, "No problem, I'll be here with our gear. I'll see you when you get back." And so Garrett stands up and he starts walking back up the well-defined 150-meter trail back up towards the campsite. And Kevin actually turned around and watched his son disappear into the trees, but he heard the sound of other campers at the campsite, and so knew his son wouldn't be alone. For the next couple of minutes, Kevin kept fishing, but periodically would look over his shoulder, expecting to see Garrett come out of the woods again, but he didn't. And after about 20 minutes, Kevin was a little bit concerned, so he picked up his fishing gear and began walking back up the trail towards the camp. When he got there, he saw other Boy Scouts and their fathers just getting up and having a bite to eat, and he's scanning around the campsite and he doesn't see Garrett, and so he goes over to Garrett's tent and he opens it up, and Garrett's not in there, and there's no sign that he's removed any of his wet clothing in there. And so Kevin turns around and he asks one of the fathers, "Hey, have you seen Garrett? He was supposed to be up here a minute ago." And the father said, "No, I haven't seen him." And so Kevin's starting to panic and he yells out to the group, "Hey, has anyone seen my son? Do you guys know where Garrett went? He was supposed to be up here." And no one knew where he was. They said, "No, we haven't seen him." And so horrified, Kevin drops all of his gear and starts running back towards the lake, screaming for his son. And the other campers instinctively know what's going on, and so they chase after him, yelling for Garrett. Almost immediately, the sheriff's department was notified, and they launched this huge search that included the FBI. And so hundreds of people have descended into the area around the lake, and they're looking for Garrett. They can't find him. But later that afternoon, searchers were about a half-mile away from where Garrett was last seen, and they found a single Nike sock that appeared to have been removed from a wet foot wedged into one of the boulders in this huge boulder field. Garrett's mother would confirm that was Garrett's sock, and so the search effort was shifted to this big boulder field, and for days they looked all over the place for him, but there was no sign of Garrett anywhere, and so eventually the search was terminated. The authorities determined this was an accident, that Garrett's father and the other campers had nothing to do with Garrett's disappearance. What their theory is Garrett must have gotten lost on the walk back to the camp and then ultimately died of exposure. But the idea that a boy of Garrett's age would get lost along a well-defined 150-meter long trail that he was familiar with, that he had been on that day, that seems a little far-fetched. Also, as Garrett was walking down that trail, he would have heard the sounds of the other campers in the campsite. So that would have helped him figure out exactly where he needed to go. He's on a well-marked trail, he's walking towards the sound of the voices. but he never made it to the campsite because no one at the camp saw him and there was no sign that he had put his wet clothes in his tent. So something happened to Garrett almost immediately when he left his father that caused him to wind up a half-mile away in a boulder field with one sock missing. It screams abduction case. But remember, this campsite was over an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization, and they know this group of Boy Scouts and their fathers were the only ones in the area that day. It is possible that an animal could have taken Garrett, like a mountain lion, but there would have been signs of a struggle, and they didn't find any on the trail or anywhere nearby, and you would figure if he was getting dragged off by a big predator, he would have yelled out for help, but he didn't. He just left his dad, it was total silence, and then he vanished. And all we have is his one sock. In 1950, when Rosemary was 21 years old, she married the love of her life, Charles Bud Kunst, and they moved into a house together in San Anselmo, California. Together, they had 6 children and 11 grandchildren. They were known as a very active couple, that when they were not with their family and their grandkids, they were out on a hiking trail somewhere enjoying the outdoors. In 1998, Rosemary's life was derailed when she and her husband were in a horrific car accident. When she came to in the hospital, she was very badly injured, and she was told that her husband of nearly 50 years had not survived. Rosemary was devastated. She was lost without Bud. But for the next several months, she poured her energy into her rehab, which took up a lot of her time, and it kept her mind off of this terrible loss. But when she got back to strength and returned home, a wave of grief washed over her, and she began to desperately miss Bud. In 2000, when Rose turned 70, she heard about a backpacking trip that was being led by a group called the Earth Circle Organization, and it sounded like the perfect way for Rose to attempt to reconnect with her late husband. The group was led by an elder and chief of the Carrick tribe. His name was Charlie Red Hawk Tom, and every year he would bring this group out to Spirit Lake, which is inside of a wilderness area near Mount Shasta in California, and there they would go to the altar that Red Hawk had built right on the edge of this lake, and they would perform spirit dances and attempt to communicate with their dead loved ones. Rose wasn't going into this thinking she was literally going to be speaking to Bud. She wanted to just find a way to connect with him spiritually, so she was very excited about this trip. The lake itself sits at the base of a heavily forested bowl with high steep walls all around it. In fact, some people say it reminds them of being inside of a mini volcano. And because of those high steep walls, there's actually only one way in or out to the lake, and that's on the north side. The only other semi-feasible way to get in or out of the lake would be on the south side, where a river flows down into the lake. And where that river flows, the embankment is less steep, although it's still a 70-degree angle and would require climbing gear, and the terrain would be completely slick from the water running over it. So you could do it, but realistically, nobody does that. So on August 17th, Rosemary, along with Red Hawk's 12-year-old son, a cook, and 11 other people, set out for Spirit Lake. After a rigorous 12-mile horseback ride, they finally arrived at Spirit Lake, and they established their camp right on the trail that leads in and out. That night, all the participants had dinner together, and then they made their way over to the altar right next to the lake where Red Hawk was, and he performed a spirit dance, and then afterwards, as a group, they attempted to call out to their dead loved ones. The following morning at 9 a.m., once everyone was up, Red Hawk informed the group that they were going to take a day trip to another lake, and they'd be back that evening. Rose told Red Hawk that she'd actually prefer to just stay at their campsite and enjoy the beauty of the lake, and Red Hawk told her that was just fine. So Red Hawk and the main group left, leaving behind Rosemary, as well as Red Hawk's 12-year-old son named Chalet, and the cook. A little while later, at 1 p.m., Rose decided she wanted to take a little hike around the side of the lake, and so she asked Chalet if he wanted to join her. He said, "Thank you for the offer, but I'm going to stay here with the cook." And so Rosemary said, "That's totally fine. I don't mind going by myself." And so she asked the cook for some food. He handed her a bag lunch. She took it, said thank you, and then set off by herself heading south. 4 hours later, at 5 p.m., when Red Hawk and the rest of the group got back to the camp, Chalet and the cook informed him that Rosemary had not come back yet. A group was immediately sent out to look for her, but there was no sign of her. And so Red Hawk turned to his son and to the cook and said, "Explain to me again what happened." And they said she was totally normal. She just wanted to go for a hike, and she took some food, and we watched her disappear into the trees. They also told Red Hawk that they had been sitting in the trail that leads in and out of the lake the entire time Rosemary was gone, and they never saw her. So she didn't leave the lake. She's somewhere out there. Confused and very concerned, Red Hawk had one of the other participants leave the lake and go contact authorities, and within 24 hours, there were 50 searchers combing the lake for Rosemary. The head of the search and rescue team was a guy named Grizz Adams, who had led many other search search and rescue efforts. After studying the area and talking to Chalet and the cook and the others who were there, he just could not understand how a 70-year-old woman had managed to vanish so quickly and completely, because there's no way she climbed out the south exit because she didn't have climbing gear, and physically she probably wasn't capable of that even with the right gear. And she didn't leave through the north exit, the main trail, because Chalet and the cook were there the entire time and they never saw her. So where was she? As the search continued to find nothing, Grizz called in more searchers on horseback, helicopters, and dog teams. But the dog teams immediately proved to be useless because they were unable to pick up her scent, despite the fact they knew exactly where she started and where she was going. Grizz said that was highly unusual. For the next several days, searchers looked in and around the lake and up onto the mountainsides, and all they could ever find was a small tuft of Rosemary's hair about a half-mile away from where she was last seen. But this hair did not help investigators come up with a theory as to what happened. Ultimately, after almost a week of searching and not finding their mother, Rosemary's children elected to terminate the search. Grizz Adams, the head of the search effort, said the only time he's ever seen something like this is when someone was trying to disappear. They were trying to end their life. But Rosemary, before she went on this hike, she asked Chalet to come with her. She wanted company. That's not indicative of someone that's trying to hurt themselves. But regardless of the reason, to this day, Rosemary has never been found. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please gift the like button a free stay at a Motel 6, but ensure you call ahead of time and tell the staff not to leave the light on. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballen. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions in the woods of North America every year. I'm talking about people that are right in front of their loved ones and then in an instant they're just gone. Or in other cases, people disappear and then are found again in places that are seemingly impossible to get to. One former police detective named David Paulides has investigated thousands of these strange disappearances, and he documents what he finds in his incredible book series called Missing 411. Today, we're going to take a look at 3 Missing 411 cases that even amongst strange disappearances, these rank as particularly bizarre. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please send a memo around to the entire office giving everybody a paid afternoon off, except for the like button. Tell them they have to stay back and mind the phones. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. June 23rd, 1963, 7-year-old Bruce Farron, along with his aunt, uncle, and cousins, began the 2-mile hike into the Uinta mountain range in Utah. They were headed for Pyramid Lake, where they planned to do some camping for a couple of days. After they arrived, they decided they would head down to the water to cool off. But right before they got in the water, Bruce told his aunt and uncle that he needed to use the bathroom. And so his family got into the water, and Bruce walked over to a grove of trees and bushes to relieve himself. After a couple of minutes, Bruce did not come out of the wood line, and so his aunt and uncle started yelling for him. He didn't come out again, and so the uncle walked up and walked into the trees to go find his nephew, but he was not there. And so his uncle starts yelling for his nephew, but he's nowhere to be found. And so he yelled back for his wife and his kids to come help him look. And for the next hour, they searched the entire area yelling for Bruce, but there was no sign of him. So they contacted the authorities. That day, a huge search was launched for Bruce, But just like his family, nobody could find any trace of him. The following day at 4 p.m., Bruce had still not been located, and at this point his family is starting to lose hope. And it was around that time that a searcher who was several miles away from where Bruce had last been seen was walking up this very steep trail heading up towards this cliff. And the searcher knew this cliff was 500 feet and there was no way a child could climb up it or down it. And so he was about to turn around and go search somewhere else when he happened to look up and he saw a child walking down the trail towards him, and the child was Bruce. And Bruce was totally fine, albeit a little bit hungry. According to David Paulides, all of these search and rescue models that predict where missing people will end up after they go missing say that boys aged 7 to 9 will be found within a 7.2 mile radius 95% of the time, and that distance could be covered over a week's time. In order for Bruce to be found where he would have needed to cover 20 miles along a rugged ridgeline before scaling down that 500-foot cliff without the aid of climbing gear, and he did all that within 30 hours, a seemingly impossible task for a missing 7-year-old boy. When asked what happened, Bruce said he didn't remember. He didn't understand why or how he had gotten lost in the first place. The only things he remembered were sleeping between 2 downed logs and drinking from a waterfall and many animals, including one that was so close to him at night that it would jump over him. Bruce was followed up with as he got older, but he never could regain the memory of what actually happened to him. Some have speculated that Bruce might have been abducted when he went to the bathroom, and that's the only way he was able to cover that great of a distance in that amount of time, that his abductor basically physically moved him at least part of the way, and that perhaps his abductor was one of these animals he saw at night. In 2007, Barbara Bullock was a 55-year-old, fit, happy, healthy woman living in Montana with her husband of 14 years. In July of that year, her husband's cousin named Donna and Donna's boyfriend named Jim Rawmaker came to stay with them for a couple of days. On the evening of the 17th, Barbara offered to take the couple hiking with her the following morning at her favorite hiking spot, which was this totally unspoiled wilderness area on the border of Idaho. Barbara liked to hike a particular trail that brought her up to the Bear Creek overlook that had this incredible view down to the valley below. The couple happily agreed, but the following morning, Donna was not feeling so good, so she couldn't go on the hike. But her boyfriend, Jim, was still feeling up for it and said, "I'd still like to go." And so he and Barbara wound up doing the hike on their own. At 1:30 that afternoon, Barbara's husband got a phone call from a police officer saying his wife was missing. And her husband just couldn't understand that. Barbara hiked in that area all the time, and she had been with Jim, so where could she have gone? But the police officer didn't have a great answer, and he just told him, "You should come down here and hear Jim's explanation about what happened." When Barbara's husband arrived at the park, he rolled right up next to the officer and Jim. He got out, and Jim, who was in total shock, began to explain what happened. He and Barbara had made it up the trail successfully to the Bear Creek overlook. They'd stayed up there for about 30 minutes. They had a picnic, and they were enjoying the scenery. And then at the end of it, they packed up, and Barbara began walking down the very well-marked trail, and she was about 20 feet ahead of him when he decided to turn around and take one more look at the beautiful view. And he said he was looking at the view for about 40 seconds before he turned back around, and Barbara was gone. And he hadn't heard her call out for help. He hadn't heard her fall. There was no sound of other people. There was no sound of other animals. There was no sound of any struggle whatsoever. It was just complete eerie silence. And as he took a few steps down the trail, he said he started looking around, expecting to just see her behind a tree or something, but she was nowhere. And as he walked, he noticed that the ground underneath every step made a lot of noise because there was lots of loose rocks and shale all over the ground. And so he stopped and he's listening really intently to see if he can hear where Barbara's gone, but he doesn't hear anything. And he's thinking, how could she have gotten away from me without me hearing the sound of her footsteps? And then he also began looking around and realized the area they were in, this trail, it was well trafficked. And so it was not very densely forested. You could actually see a pretty good distance in all directions because there was enough space between the trees. And so he's looking around thinking there's almost nowhere to hide. And so Jim started to feel scared and just began walking down the trail, expecting to run into her at any moment. But he didn't, and he kept turning around and looking behind trees and rocks, and he's thinking, this is impossible. I should have seen her. I should see her now. Where could she have possibly gone? And so he made his way all the way down the trail, the whole time turning around and looking for her and yelling for her, but never getting any feedback from her. And he got all the way to the parking lot and he saw her car was still parked in the parking lot. And he's looking around the parking lot, she's not out there. And he noticed a crew was working in the road. And he went up to them and he asked if they had seen her or anybody come out of that trail. And they said no. And so Jim's starting to panic and he ran right back up the trail, all the way back up to the Bear Creek Overlook, hoping that along the way he would see some indication of where she went. But again, there was nothing on the trail. He gets up to the overlook, he's looking around, he's yelling for her, nothing. And so he ran right back down again and he contacted authorities. Over the next 48 hours, a huge search was launched all around this area for Barbara. It included helicopters and huge search teams and highly trained sniffing dogs, but nothing was found. There was no signs of foul play. There was no signs of an animal attack or some sort of abduction. There was nothing. Not even her scent was found, despite the fact that the dog's handlers knew exactly where her last position was. But none of the dogs picked it up, which is highly unusual. It really was like she had vanished into thin air. At first, Jim was obviously a suspect because he was the last person to see Barbara alive, but he never changed his story despite how far-fetched it seemed, and he was very cooperative and was very quick to offer to take a polygraph test, and so the police ruled him out as a suspect. And shortly after the search started, they shut it down because there was no sign of this woman anywhere. And so unfortunately, her family had to face the awful reality of getting zero closure. She was just gone and nobody knew what happened. And unfortunately, to this day, we still don't know what happened because no trace of Barbara has ever been found. In 1910, 23-year-old Orville Tuttle worked as a locomotive engineer in Whitehall, Montana. While he loved his job and loved cars, his real passion was hunting. His friends would describe him as being a fearless hunter, a crack shot, and very cool under pressure. In October of that year, Orville, along with his younger brother and his cousin, headed off to a river valley just outside of Yellowstone National Park to do some hunting. When they got there, they made their way into the forest, they found a decent clearing, they brushed off some snow, and they set up their campsite. They stayed up for a bit around the campfire that night, but everybody went to bed early. The following morning, Orville was the first one to wake up, and while he was outside of the campsite, he noticed some elk tracks that had passed by in the night. And so he woke up his brother and cousin and told them he was going to go and track this animal for no longer than about an hour. The two men said that was fine. They knew Orville was a very accomplished outdoorsman, and so they weren't worried about him. An hour later, the brother and the cousin were now awake, and they were sitting around the fire waiting for Orville to return, but he didn't. The men waited another hour, and another hour, and another hour, and still Orville never showed up. And this whole time, the men are considering, should we go out and go looking for him? And every time they'd stand up to go begin their search, they'd say, you know what, I'm sure he's fine, we're overreacting, and they'd sit back down again. But by nightfall, when they still had not seen Orville or heard from him, the pair was starting to get really nervous. And so they decided they would go to bed, and Orville was bound to turn up in the middle of the night. Early the next morning, the two men got up, hoping to see Orville, but he had not returned. And so the two men left the forest. They got two more family members to come back with them, and then the four of them began a search for Orville. And very quickly, they found Orville's tracks leading out of the camp, meandering their way through this very thick forest and through all the snow, all the way down to this very shallow river that at its deepest point was no higher than your ankle. Orville's tracks stopped at the edge of this river and continued for 3 miles, walking away from the campsite right alongside this river until they stopped in this little clearing in the snow where there was a very small campfire set up. But the logs and the kindling in the campfire had not been burned. And so the search party figured that Orville, when he got here, must have had wet matches or something because he couldn't get the fire going. And then from the campfire, they continued to follow Orville's tracks a little bit farther down the river until they turned and walked directly into this very shallow river. And then from there, the search party looked for miles and miles and miles downstream and upstream, and they never found any tracks leaving the river, even though alongside the entire river on both sides was plenty of snow. So anybody who walked into the river and then walked out again would leave tracks. But there were no more tracks. As it started to get dark and they still had not found any sign of Orville, one of the men left the forest and contacted authorities, who launched a formal search. The sheriff's department, along with hundreds of volunteers, descended into this area where Orville got lost, and they started by searching even farther downstream and upstream of this river to see if they could find where Orville stepped out of the river, but they too couldn't find any tracks. And so for a couple of days, they searched this river and the surrounding forests, but there was just no sign of Orville. Then on the third evening of the search, one of the searchers was up in the mountains in an area that was relatively close to the last area where Orville had tracks in the snow. And the searcher saw there was a little campfire that had been set up in the middle of nowhere. He walked up to it and he saw it had been recently extinguished. It was still warm, and next to this fire was a pair of boots. But there was no person anywhere in the vicinity. And then the searcher noticed there were tracks leaving this campfire, and these tracks were made with bare feet. And so the searcher just began following these tracks. And so the searcher went up a mountain, he went down the other side, down into this deep ravine, and then he stopped because he's looking straight ahead of him, and it's another mountain going straight up, and that's where the tracks continue to go. And it's very thickly forested, and it's starting to get dark. And so he's thinking to himself, is it a good idea to just continue walking on my own? Or should I go back and get some help? And so as he's weighing out what he should do next, he catches movement out of his peripheral vision, and he kind of glances up into the mountain right ahead of him, and he sees this dark figure kind of slowly moving up the mountain quite a ways away from him. But from his perspective, even though he doesn't have a good view, it looks like a man. And so if it's a man walking up this hill, it's probably the same guy that left that campfire and therefore is leaving these barefoot tracks up this mountain. And so the searcher thinks that's gotta be Orville. Something's wrong with him. Who knows what's going on with him, but I gotta get his attention. And so the searcher yells out to this guy to try to get him to stop. But even though he was clearly in earshot, this guy just did not stop moving. He just methodically continued moving up the mountain. And so the searcher's confused at why this person wouldn't stop. And so he pulls out his pistol and fires 3 shots into the air, which is like the universal stop what you're doing and turn around. But again, this figure, this person, this guy didn't stop. They didn't react, no flinching. They just kept moving up and over the top of the mountain and out of sight. And so now the searcher's thinking to himself, what did I just see? Who is that? What were they doing out here? And he's thinking, you know what? It's too dark. I can't just continue up this mountain towards whoever this is. I got to go back. And so the searcher marked where he was, turned around, and he ran back to the search party, and he told them what he had seen. And they said, okay, well, we'll go looking tomorrow. And so the next morning early, this huge search party gets to that ravine where he marked that spot. But at this point, so much snow had fallen, all the tracks of this barefoot man who was walking around the night before have all been covered up. And so despite doing a very extensive search with a lot of people in that area, they couldn't find any trace of the shoeless man. Many believe the shoeless man was Orville. And in fact, the local newspapers at the time speculated as much. But if it was Orville, why didn't he turn around when someone was yelling his name or when multiple gunshots were fired into the air? And where was he going walking barefoot in a snowstorm in the middle of the night? Others have speculated this was not Orville, that it was some other person or some other creature lurking around the woods at night, and that perhaps they had something to do with whatever happened to Orville. But regardless of who or what that figure was, no one ever found any traces of Orville or the shoeless man ever again. So that's going to do it, guys. If you want to learn more about the missing 411 phenomenon, I would encourage you to check out the official YouTube page of Missing 411. It's called the Can-Am Missing Project. That's David Paulides' official and only YouTube page. I would also encourage you to go to canammissing.com, where you can purchase all of the Missing 411 books, as well as check out their documentaries, and all this information is linked in the description below. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballen. I also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballen Shorts, where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.